Melissa lounged in the living room, comfortably sitting on a plush window seat. The warmth of the sun tanning her arm through the sheet of glass. Her eyes were glued to the book resting on her lap. She was halfway through the 200-page novel. The pup squirmed on her lap, eager for a belly rub. Melissa's hand rested on his flurry head, but she did not wiggle her fingers to scratch him. He whimpered, shedding fur as he tossed and turned. Melissa was completely engulfed in the story and couldn't be bothered to play. The romance detailed on the pages stirred something within her. An audible gasp left her lips at the tension between the romantic leads. It all felt quite similar to her own whirlwind marriage. The frustration in the earlier days eventually led to a friendship. The blooming unspoken sexual tension. The characters struggled to understand their love for someone else. Melissa kept telling herself one more page, and then she'd go for a walk, stretch her stiffened legs, and take the dog for a stroll. Yet, the pages continued to turn, nearly cutting her finger on a sharp edge, and she was glued in place. The doors to the living room opened. Melissa didn't seem to notice. Even as the gust of air dared to turn her page, she clenched the novel until her knuckles turned white and ignored the visitor. Someone said her name. Loud enough to tickle her ears, but not demanding enough to make her look up. "Melissa?" David stepped closer to his wife. "I've been calling you." Without a glance, Melissa placed a finger to her lips. She held it there. No sound. No further movement. Her eyes moved over the page, left to right, in a steady fashion. The gesture stunned him. David crossed the room completely, hovering over his wife. His tone would usually bring a chill to her spine. She knew how he hated repeating himself. Still, her focus was elsewhere. "I hope you understand," he took a deep inhale, steadily relaxing as he finished, "the level of restraint it is taking for me not to tear that book from your grip." "Shush. Did you just shush dash? Quiet." David hovered over her. He waited for her to acknowledge him. Instead, his wife went on reading. When the corgi yelped in excitement, David glared. Tossing his head to the side, David signaled for the pup to scurry off. It let out a whimper before trotting away underneath the table. When he turned his attention back to his wife, a diabolical plan formed in his mind. David went and closed the living room doors. He crossed the room quickly to be back near his wife afterward. "Is that story truly more important than speaking to me? At the very least, you could look at me." "Stop talking." Melissa's eyes widened at whatever she was reading. David sat on the window seat, draping her legs across his lap. "I could punish you for that." Melissa glared at him over the rim of the book. She reclined against the wall, getting comfortable. She could feel David's hands on her stocking-covered legs, creeping higher underneath her chemise. Melissa ignored him as she turned the page. His hands moved higher, and he could feel her shivering. David kept his gaze on her face. When David's hand slipped under her, Melissa gasped and bit her lip. Her fingers gripped the hardback tight, and pressed her lips into a tight line. She could try to ignore him, but Melissa would give in soon enough. She always did. "David," she lowered the book with a sigh. "Shush," he mocked with a sly grin on his lips. "I'm trying to read." "I can see that." His fingers brushed the patch of hair between her legs. "David," Melissa groaned when his fingers shifted. "Read your book." He moved his fingers teasingly. When he touched her sensitive little nub, her hips jumped forward. Melissa's eyes shut. The book was shaking in her loosening grip. Her thighs fell open for him, and she sank down in her seat. She felt his hand go still, and her eyes opened. "Read your book," David warned, his tone low and demanding. Melissa met his stern gaze. The couple stared at each other, waiting for their spouse to back down. She reached for his hand, but David withdrew it back. "You have my attention." Her voice was low, even as she tried to speak confidently. "Are you happy now?" Her husband shifted off the seat, turning her body with him. Melissa laid back against the glass of the window. The sun's rays beamed down the back of her neck. Positioning himself on his knees, David lifted the hem of her dress. He smirked at the innocence and confusion on Melissa's face. Teasingly, David licked his fingers, keeping eye contact with her as he did. He put his damp hand between her legs, his fingers touching her delicate flesh. He rubbed the nub with two fingers in tantalizingly lazy circles. David admired her twisted facial features. His middle finger slipped inside her, making her gasp. He turned his finger upward, thrusting fast. His other hand moved to her shoulder, catching the edge of her chemise beneath her dress. Swiftly, he pulled down the fabric to expose her breasts. Her body trembled at his teasing, enduring the most blissful torture. His lips covered one of her breasts. David flicked his tongue over her delicate flesh. Melissa moaned, arching her back, eager to be closer to him. His head disappeared beneath the fabric. Melissa clamped a hand over her mouth when she felt his tongue on her skin. David's tongue moved slowly against her. Her body was coming undone against his mouth. "You should be reading," he murmured against her, well aware his wife wasn't doing as he instructed. She nearly dropped her book. David lifted her right leg to drape over his shoulder. Melissa tried to focus her eyes, but she was unable to find her place on the page. She simply gawked at the top line of the book, her jaw hanging open. There was no resisting him. Melissa dropped her book to grip his head. David pulled back, removing her hands in the process. He quickly stood, brushing invisible dust from his attire. He avoided eye contact. He'd burst into a fit of laughter if he saw her expression. Pulling out a handkerchief to clean his damp mouth, David saw Melissa's bewildered face out the corner of his eye. Melissa's wide eyes, agape mouth, and heavily creased brow were too amusing. "What do you think you are doing?" He used the cloth to cover his snicker. "I just remembered I have a meeting in a few minutes." "Why did you seek me out then?" He stepped back, stroking his chin in thought. David smiled, slow and calculated, every bit the rogue he was reputed as even in marriage. "I bet next time I call you you'll answer right away." David Henderson. Quiet, he chortled, walking off. "Enjoy the rest of your book."